Welcome, everyone, to Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We're your hosts and co-founders of FantasyForesight.com, coming to you from the Rambo Fixture Company studios. I'm Ben.
And I'm Jay.
You ready to get rolling, Jay?
You know it. Let's do this.
All right, let's go. Welcome in, everyone. It is Saturday, August 29th. We've got the preview of the wide receivers and tight ends of the AFC South. And once again, Fantasy Foresight, the podcast, is live. How you doing today, Jay?
Ben, I am good, man. Coffee in tow. We're previewing another division. Only 3 episodes left of the preview series, man. You know what that means? Football is almost here. Real, actual football we get to watch. Oh, we're less than 2 weeks away. Every day I get more excited and more nervous, but fingers crossed, let's keep this going. Let's prepare our fantasy teams for the season and hope we make it there. So let's go.
Absolutely. And before we dive in, if this is your first time listening, just know that we are speaking in terms of single QB full PPR redraft by default. All of our ADP data comes from fantasyfootballcalculator.com according to 12-team full PPR settings, and all of our fantasy finishes as well as fantasy points per game calculations are all based on full PPR limited to weeks 1 through 16 according to fantasypros.com. And with that out of the way, let's dive right into this. Steve could not be with us this morning, but you can find all of his great work under the Foresight Encyclopedia tab at fantasyforesight.com. And I do have his notes in hand today, so nice. I will be able to reference those throughout the episode. And Steve will be back with us on Wednesday. So we are going to go in order of ADP through the tight ends and wide receivers of the AFC South. I say tight ends first because there's only 2, and we're going to get them out of the way very quickly. Starting off in the 13th round at the 1308, tight end 16, Tennessee Titans tight end Jonnu Smith. It's not all bad, though. He's going behind TJ Hawkinson and Mike Gesicki and in front of Chris Herndon and Blake Jarwin. Man, he and the Titans have the worst tight end strength of schedule and the 15th ranked offensive line.
You said it wasn't all bad.
Well, it's not all bad. I'll get there. Hang on. The aggregate projection for Jonnu is tight end 19, and Total Foresight likes him as tight end 22. Last 3 years in fantasy points per game, it hasn't been there. He hasn't been the man. He hasn't gotten the opportunity. But he did not miss a game last year after Delaney Walker went down. Had almost an 80% catch rate, but it was on, unfortunately, some low volume, 35 receptions on 44 targets for 439 yards and 3 touchdowns. 12.5 yards per reception, though. So nice yards per reception, nice catch rate. So, hey, give the man the ball more. That's what I got to say about it. And surprisingly, he was also given the opportunity to run the ball a little bit, 3 attempts for 71 yards, which was actually first in tight end rush yards and tied for second in tight end rush attempts. He was only tight end 19 overall last year, but at Next Gen Stats, I saw that he was tight end 4 in separation, tight end 2 in yak per reception, and tight end 1 in yak per reception above expectation. At playerprofiler.com, he was 2nd in yards per target, 3rd in fantasy points per target, and 6th in QB rating when targeted. So there's some more encouraging metrics for you, Jay. And from week 7 on, with Tannehill starting, Jonnu had 4 of 9 tight end 1 weeks, which equated to 44% to a 44% tight end 1 rate. Over an entire season, that 44% tight end 1 rate would have ranked 11th amongst all tight ends. And Jonnu is one of my favorite late round tight end flyers in 2020 because, as we know, half of all tight end 1s are drafted outside the top 12 tight ends every year. Plus, when you look at those yak numbers from Next Gen Stats, consider this from Teron Davenport via rotoworld.com. Quote, Titans tight end coach Todd Downing recently was quoted saying, quote, "He makes it fun," Downing gushed. "When you have a guy on your offense that can do so many things, you can be creative and find ways to get him touches. A perfect fit for the Titans non-focused, yak-friendly attack, end quote. So, he's going pretty much for free. There are a couple of very intriguing guys going around him, and Mike Gesicki and Chris Herndon and Blake Jarwin. But I mean, he's as good of a late round tight end flyer as anybody. Delaney Walker is gone. He's getting all the tight end volume, and I'm fine with it if you want to take a dart throw on him. At this point, I'm probably leaning Chris Herndon of that group, but yeah, Jonnu's fine with me.
I know a lot of people are excited about Jonnu Smith and the prospect he brings for the 2020 fantasy season, but you're right, the group he's going around is such a great group of late value tight ends. I'm a Hawk guy, even though he's a little banged up right now, so that he's probably out for me on that group, but Mike Gesicki, Chris Herndon, Blake Jarwin all have some great upside potential heading into the season. So Jonnu Smith fits right into that group. So really, it's all about preference. I don't like the strength of schedule ranking. I know that may not necessarily mean everything, but that's a little concerning. But the rest of his numbers are just fantastic. Really, the separation numbers, the yards after catch, the guy makes plays just like his coach says. I mean, his coach is saying exactly what we're seeing in the numbers. So, yeah, there's something to be excited about. And you're right, Ben. Half the tight ends that'll finish the season inside the top 12 are drafted outside the top 12. So you have a great shot at picking up a tight end one outside the top 12 drafted tight ends each season. And really, this group seems primed to make that true once again.
I will say that looking at Steve notes last year, Jonnu did only see 6 red zone targets and hauled in 2 touchdowns off of those 6 targets. So, he definitely needs to see a little bit more uptick in the red zone for my liking, especially at the tight end dependent or the touchdown dependent tight end position. But Jonnu, it's all relative to price. If he doesn't ball out in week 1, if he doesn't get 5, 6, 7 targets in week 1, just cut him. And then it's no big deal, and go replace him.
Well, at the tight end position, we kicked this episode off at tight end 16 in the 13th round. It was very close to only being one tight end that we discussed in this division, because the next guy going off the board is Jack Doyle, who's being drafted as tight end 20, and he's the last tight end going currently in 12-team PPR redraft formats at the very end of the 13th round, before you take your defenses and kickers. So he's going right behind Blake Jarwin, who we just mentioned, and Eric Ebron. Right now, the Colts have the 19th ranked strength of schedule for the tight end position, and as we've mentioned in our last podcast, they do have the best ranked offensive line according to Pro Football Focus. He is projected, though, to finish in as tight end 14 according to the aggregate projection, and also tight end 14 according to Total Foresight. The last 3 seasons, his points per game, now he has been a little nicked up with injuries at some point, but in 2017, he finished in as tight end 6, 2018, tight end 10, and last season, tight end 23 in points per game. Now, last season, he did not miss a game, even though he did finish as tight end 23 in points per game. He finished with 42 catches on 68 targets for 442 yards. We talked about how Jonnu Smith had an amazing almost 80% catch rate. Jack Doyle finished in with right around 62% catch rate. He did have a nice, healthy 10.5 yard per reception average and 4 touchdowns. Despite finishing as tight end 23 in points per game, he was tight end 15 overall, so that's really in line with his current projections and still better than his tight end 20 price tag. According to Next Gen Stats, he was tight end 8 in separation, and according to PlayerProfiler.com, he was, however, 6th in drops with 5. That'll affect the catch rate. And 16th in injury probability and 15th in fragility rating. As I had mentioned, he has had some injuries over the years. Jack Doyle has been battling a neck injury, and per Fox 59 via rotoworld.com, Quote, Frank Reich said the tight end position would be a really, really important dynamic for the team's offense this year. No team has recorded more tight end touchdowns than the Colts over the past 2 seasons, and new quarterback Phillip Rivers targeted his tight ends an NFL high 36% of the time from 2014 to 2019. The team has talked up Trey Burton as a more athletic tight end who could take the place of Eric Ebron. Burton, who played under Reich in Philadelphia, will be worth monitoring in deeper leagues. He could become a fantasy starter if Doyle misses time in 2020, close quote. So there you have it, Ben. An excellent summary right there from Roto World.
And you know what? Steve's notes and research are right in line with that. Last year, Jack Doyle and Eric Ebron combined for 23 red zone targets and 5 touchdowns. So whether it's Jack Doyle or Trey Burton, whoever it is, keep an eye on the tight end for the Colts, because between Frank Reich's philosophy and Phillip Rivers' tendency, they like to go that direction in their passing game, and it's something to look out for. You know,
that's a great combination. I mean, you have historical data from the Colts and their coaching staff, and then you also have that historical data from their new quarterback, and the fact that he's got the best offensive line, he'll have time to throw and find those targets. So yeah, I mean, that is a good equation for the Colts tight ends this season.
But keep your eye out for Trey Burton in that offense. And in this division, I know it sounds crazy, but there have been some recent reports about chemistry between your guy, Gardner Minshew, and one tight end, Tyler Eifert, for the Jacksonville Jaguars. So, you know, especially if you're in some sort of 2 tight end league, you know,
or tight end premium, something like that. Yep.
Yeah, but keep Tyler Eifert in mind, because if they do pass the ball a ton and Tyler Eifert stays healthy, Gardner Minshew's probably going to give him some red zone targets as well. But that does it for the tight ends in this division. We are moving on to the wide receivers now. And first up, we have Tennessee Titans wide receiver A.J. Brown. He's currently going as wide receiver 18 at the 408, behind Calvin Ridley and behind Robert Woods, and in front of DK Metcalf and DJ Chark. But he has the 6th worst wide receiver strength of schedule, and again, the 15th ranked offensive line. The Foresight aggregate projection is wide receiver 19, and his total Foresight rank is wide receiver 33. So maybe some cause for, maybe watch out for a little bit of regression is what total Foresight is saying there. He was only wide receiver 30 in fantasy points per game last season. Didn't miss a game last year, had 927 yards in weeks 1 through 16, 19.3 yards per reception and 7 touchdowns off just 48 receptions and 76 targets. He also had a little bit of impact on the ground, got in the end zone, 3 attempts for 60 rush yards and 1 rushing touchdown.
Nice.
He was wide receiver 23 overall, 18th in top 6 percentages. He was 14th in wide receiver 1 percentage. He was 14th in consistency from weeks 10 through 16. He was 13th in Foresight consistency, 13th in touchdowns per reception, 27th in 20-plus yard plays per reception, but just 50th in targets. And he was 25th in yards, 6th in yards per reception, 11th in touchdowns, 9th in wide receiver rush yards, and 2nd in wide receiver touchdowns. It doesn't take a lot with just 1 touchdown.
Right.
At nextgenstats.com, he was wide receiver 1 in yak per reception and in yak per reception above expectation. And at playerprofiler.com, his best comp is Andre Johnson, and he was 2nd in yards per target, 1st in production premium, 2nd in fantasy points per target, and 3rd in QB rating when targeted. Ryan Tannehill took over as a starter in week 7. From that point on, A.J. Brown was wide receiver 21 in consistency, including 3 top 7 finishes versus just 1 in the first 6 weeks. So he was clearly better with Tannehill than without. Were his numbers supported by 7 touchdowns? Yes, but 1, that's not some crazy number. And 2, remember, Brown did everything he did last year on just 48 catches and 76 targets. Weeks 1 through 6, he averaged less than 4 targets per game. From week 7 on, he averaged more than 6. So I definitely see 100 plus targets for this yards per reception beast in 2020, and at more than 12 yards per target in 2019. 100 targets would equate to more than 1,200 receiving yards for this guy, and that would have been 4th most among wide receivers last year. I love the player and I love the talent, but I do have to say, of the guys going around him, I would take 3 of 4 over him, but that just speaks more to the insane wide receiver value at that point in drafts more than anything else.
I assume DK's the lone man out there in that group.
You are correct.
All
Absolutely.
right. Excellent. You know what? I'm a big A.J. Brown guy. I love the talent. I think he's a premier young wide receiver. The fact that he finished in as WR30 in points per game as a rookie, I think is actually testament to his ability. You know, we heard all of the player profiler stats where he was literally top 3 in some significant statistical categories, and then some other notable stat ranks. He was, top 14, top 18 in most stat categories. And again, yes, he's going as WR18, but I think in his sophomore year, he takes another step forward. And like you said, he really didn't have a ton of volume, and he was able to equate that to some pretty nice numbers last season. So if he just gets fed a little bit more, taking a step forward should not be that hard. So I think there is value with him at WR18. And I, for one, have been trying so hard in our League of Record to acquire A.J. Brown as my WR3 because I know he's a WR2, so I feel like that he'll return some great value in that spot on my roster. I just can't seem to get it done. But I got to say, I love A.J. Brown in 2020.
Yeah, and Steve has some pretty interesting notes about him as well. A.J. Brown led the team in red zone targets, but only had 8 red zone targets.
Right.
That number tied Cole Beasley for fewest red zone targets to lead their team in the entire NFL. So, he has an opportunity to go up in that metric as well. 8 red zone targets on a full season is nothing at all. So, we certainly could improve upon that in 2020.
Well, let's move on to our next player who's going a couple spots behind my guy A.J. Brown, and that's DJ Chark, who is currently being drafted as WR20 with the first pick in the 5th round in drafts. And like I said, he's going behind A.J. Brown and DK Metcalf and in front of Tyler Lockett and Terry McLaurin. Another interesting group of receivers going in this range. Right now, the Jacksonville Jaguars have the 13th ranked strength of schedule for the wide receiver position and the 26th ranked offensive line. So that's not great, but hey, they may need to throw the ball a ton. And I'm very intrigued on DJ Chark because he really burst onto the scene last season. So really the question is, can he do it again? His aggregate projection right now is WR34, and as I mentioned, he's being drafted as WR20. Total Foresight likes him as WR31 this season, and as I mentioned, he's going in as WR20 in drafts. 2 years ago, he finished the season as WR 137 in points per game, and last season, he really, like I said, exploded onto the scene, finished in as WR 13 overall in points per game in fantasy. He did miss 1 game during the fantasy season and finished with 69 catches on 113 targets for a 61% catch rate, but he racked up almost 1,000 yards with 974 yards and a 14-yard per catch average. He did add 8 touchdowns and had 17 plays of greater than 20 yards. So let's dive into some of his notable stats from last season. In addition to being WR13 in points per game, he was WR16 overall in fantasy. He was 14th in consistency, 16th in top 6 percentage, 12th in WR1 percentage. That means only 11 wide receivers finished as a top 12 receiver week after week in fantasy. He was 15th in WR2 percentage, 19th in WR3 percentage, so you get this nice floor as well with DJ Chark, in addition to some very nice consistency. He was 19th in targets per game, 25th in touchdowns per reception, 20th in receptions overall, and 20th in targets, 22nd in yards. He was 8th in receptions of greater than 20 yards and 7th in touchdowns. According to Next Gen Stats, he was WR12 overall in percentage of teams' average targeted air yards. So he was getting the ball a ton on his team. According to PlayerProfiler.com, his best comparable is Devontae Parker, and he was 13th in Dominator rating. DJ Chark's 2019 breakout was legit, and he's here to stay. The Jags have a weak defense, and he has the man, the myth, the legend, Gardner Minshew, slinging him the rock. At WR20, you're getting him at his floor. Plus, offensive coordinator Jay Gruden has been gushing about this guy all offseason and plans to use him all over the field in a variety of formations.
Yeah, and looking at Steve's notes, D.D. Westbrook actually led this team with 11 red zone targets and 3 touchdowns, but DJ Chark was second with 10, and he had 3 scores as well. So both these guys had 6 goal line targets, with Chark scoring twice and Westbrook scoring once. So tight end targets were almost non-existent. That is noteworthy, but a healthy Tyler Eifert could change that. We mentioned Tyler Eifert earlier on, but it is notable to see that Chark is right there with Westbrook to lead the team in targets. So he's clearly involved in that, and I think that's what's most relevant about that.
Well,
and you know, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, Ben, I know not much is expected of the Jaguars this season. They're projected to be one of the worst teams in the NFL record-wise. But from a fantasy perspective, even though it's a weird and kind of abbreviated preseason, you do have some time for Gardner Minshew to get more snaps with the first team and really have a true preseason to get him ready. There's not a lot of mix-up on the offensive side of the ball this season heading into the season. So you would expect this offense to take a little bit of a step forward. And, as we've noted, the defense is not expected to be good. So this offense should have to sling the rock quite a bit and spread the ball around to keep up with teams. So they're going to be playing from behind. They're going to be forced to throw the ball a lot. And really, this offense should take a step forward and be pretty decent. So I had some reservations about DJ Chark coming into the season, but really after analyzing everything, I do feel like he has a great chance of repeating his breakout performance from last season, and I expect this Jacksonville offense to actually be pretty good in fantasy.
I mean, the volume's going to be there
Right,
from a game
exactly.
script perspective, without a doubt. And I think the quality of the offensive volume is going to improve because Jay Gruden, as an offensive coordinator, is legitimate. That's how he got himself a job as a head coach in the NFL. So, I'm expecting some sneaky good things out of this Jaguars offense from a fantasy perspective. Like you said, it might not translate in the record books in real games and things of that nature. But, just from a fantasy perspective, it could be all good. Next up in this division, we have Indianapolis Colts wide receiver T.Y. Hilton. He's currently going as wide receiver 24 at the 5'10 spot behind Terry McLaurin, Keenan Allen, and in front of Cortland Sutton and Marquise Brown. The Colts wide receivers have the 3rd best wide receiver strength of schedule and the best offensive line. The aggregate projection for TY is wide receiver 24, while total Foresight only likes him as wide receiver 35. In fantasy points per game over the last 3 years, it's been really up and down for TY. In 2017, in fantasy points per game, he was wide receiver 33. He improved that in 2018 to wide receiver 10, but last year it came right back down to wide receiver 32 in fantasy points per game in 2019. He missed 6 games last year and caught 42 balls on 65 targets for about a 65% catch rate and 430 yards receiving. He had 10.2 yards per reception, pretty low for TY, and only 5 touchdowns. And he was just wide receiver 58 overall in his limited action. But his consistency numbers really give you a better idea of what he actually was last year. He was 32nd in consistency, 22nd in top 6 percentage, 22nd in wide receiver 1 percentage, 30th in wide receiver 2 percentage, 31st in targets per game, 23rd in touchdowns per reception. At playerprofiler.com, he was 3rd in dominator rating and 11th in fantasy points per route, but he is now 3rd in injury probability and 14th in fragility rating, which is very unfortunate. He is now 31. And again, he started this August off with a hamstring issue. Now, if he can stay healthy, and that is one big if, he was a whole different guy with Andrew Luck at the helm from a yards per game perspective. And Phillip Rivers has every bit of the big arm that Andrew Luck had, but I still don't think his high injury risk is baked well enough into his wide receiver 24 price tag for my liking. In best ball or DFS spots, sure, but in redraft, give me all four guys going around him instead, please. Thank you.
And that's it, man. You know, Ty, gosh, what an elite talent. And you, like, the name carries so much weight that, you know, it's hard to pass him up when he starts falling down draft boards, because you're like, man, I can get T.Y. Hilton this late, but boy, the risk is really there. And you said it, you know, already starting off this preseason with a soft tissue injury, and we're going to see that a lot around the league. You know, we've had a lot of Achilles injuries. We've had a lot of soft tissue injuries already because of the abbreviated preseason. So, you know, that's concerning for Ty, and you really said it, Ben. Where he's going in drafts, you know, you look at his numbers and you think, okay, that might be appropriate. But then you look at the guys going around him, and there's so many safer plays. And, you know, I hate to say it, but maybe even a little more upside or a safer floor. And it's a tough group for him. So, yeah, you know, I think maybe his price might still be a little bit too much for where we expect him to finish, with everything, you know, in consideration heading into 2020.
Yeah, and looking at Steve notes, Zach Pascal actually led wide receivers on this team.
Wow.
With red zone targets with 11. Ty clocked in last year in limited action with 8 such targets, but he did convert that into all 5 of his touchdowns. So
wow. Well, there you go.
But Steve does note that according to his research, Ty has never heavily been targeted as far as the wide receiver in the red zone goes. So we'll see if that changes with Phillip Rivers, and we'll see, quite frankly, if Ty can stay healthy and stay on the field.
Good gracious. Stop talking about health. Everybody in fantasy, we need to have a little J session on about our next player. We need to calm down a little bit, all right? The next wide receiver coming off the board in this division, and maybe this is more of a reflection of the only receivers left in this division, it's Will Fuller, okay? He's being drafted as WR30 at the end of the 6th round. Let me tell you who he's going around in drafts. The 2 guys going ahead of him are Devontae Parker and A.J. Green. The 2 guys going behind him, Michael Gallup and Julian Edelman. Everybody in fantasy, what are we doing? All right, let me get to why. I can understand why people are still enthralled with his upside, but we'll get to that. Right now, the Texans have the 3rd worst strength of schedule for the wide receiver position and the 19th ranked offensive line, according to Pro Football Focus. Will Fuller, his aggregate projection is WR36. And Total Foresight likes him as WR39. Again, I remind you he's going as WR30 in drafts. His points per game over the last 3 years, he was WR28 in 2017, WR20 in 2018, and WR39 last season, again in points per game. Now, we're going to start getting into some of the issues. He did miss another 4 games last season. He finished with 49 receptions on 71 targets and had a nice, healthy 69% catch rate. Finished with 670 yards and 3 touchdowns. Despite being WR39 in points per game, he was WR49 overall. He was 25th in top 6 percentage, but 47th in WR1 percentage. 48 receivers finished as a WR1 more often than Will Fuller. He was 53rd in WR2 percentage and 58th in WR3 percentage. It gets worse. The lower you set the bar. Not good. He was just 57th in consistency overall, and we're going to get to more of this in just a minute. According to PlayerProfiler.com, he was 11th in drop rate, despite having a pretty good catch rate. He was 7th in injury probability. He is 7th in injury probability, 18th in fragility rating, on top of being just 33rd in fantasy points per target. So let's review. In 11 games, he had 2 top 10 performances. However, his next best 2 games were only good enough for WR34 and WR41, everybody.
That was as good as it got.
That's
it got
as
a lot
good
worse.
I understand his best 2 games were really good, but everything else was really not good. If you started him aside from week 5 or 12, he absolutely killed you in every week that you did. He was just 42nd in targets per game with DeAndre Hopkins on the field. He'll need to see a lot more volume to justify his WR30 price tag. And in order to see more volume, he has to stay a lot closer to 100% health and a lot more often this year. Plain and simple, there's not one wide receiver going around him that I wouldn't take over Will Fuller.
Totally agree. And I think Steve has some great notes to help drive this point home from a different perspective. When he looked at the Texans in 2019 from a red zone perspective, he noted that DeAndre Hopkins had 13 red zone targets. That is it. Christian McCaffrey had as many, as did Auden Tate, to put that number into perspective. Deshaun Watson only ranked 18th amongst all quarterbacks in overall red zone attempts. So any one guy getting a large share of red zone targets probably isn't in the cards for any of these guys, Cooks, Cobb, Fuller, or Stills. I understand that he has some very legitimate and impressive high-end top side numbers. Again, DFS, best ball, sure. But at wide receiver 30, you still have legitimate wide receivers in that tier. Devontae Parker, AJ Green, Michael Gallup, Julian Edelman.
What are we doing, everybody?
In legit fantasy wide receivers. I am not yet going to be. There are some points where you pick your spots in drafts, where you roll your dice and you say, hey, there's some risk with this guy, but man, the upside's crazy good. Will Fuller is not that guy, ladies and gentlemen. I do not think so. And watch, this is going to be the year where he puts it together, 15 games, and he's going to put up like 1,400 yards.
I don't like to say bro, but bro, even in best ball, he's going to give you what? 2 weeks where he makes your starting lineup? Is that worth a roster spot? Any guy that I pull off the street can give me 2 weeks in a season where he's going to make my starting lineup. I mean, come on, man.
And, at best over the last 3 years, he's been wide receiver 20 in fantasy points per game, with people being able to primarily focus on DeAndre Hopkins.
And again, that's
no more, sir.
Per game.
That's per game. And that's not the best cornerbacks, not the best safeties. Probably the best 2 DBs on that team are locking up DeAndre Hopkins. No more of that. Now the primary focus is going to be on you guys. So I'm definitely in this wide receiver group. If you're going with any of them, Will Fuller at his price tag is the lowest on that list for me.
Well, does it get any better with any of their other receivers?
The best wide receiver to take relative to his price tag may not be on this podcast, and his name's Randall Cobb because he's going undrafted. But next up, we do have Houston Texans wide receiver Brandon Cooks, who is, I think, a better option than his teammate Will Fuller this year. He is currently going as wide receiver 34, a little cheaper at the 708 spot, behind Julian Edelman, behind Tyler Boyd, and in front of Jarvis Landry and Deontay Johnson. Like we said, though, the wide receivers for the Texans have the 3rd worst strength of schedule at the wide receiver spot and the 19th ranked offensive line. Brandon Cooks is only wide receiver 40 in aggregate projection and wide receiver 41 in total foresight. It's sad to see how far he's fallen, but I think the pendulum might have swung a little too far. In 2017, remember, this guy was wide receiver 17 in fantasy points per game. And in 2018, he was wide receiver 22 in fantasy points per game. And in 2019, it definitely fell off a cliff in fantasy points per game, wide receiver 66. But 2 out of the last 3 years. He's a wide receiver 2 in fantasy points per game, and has the opportunity to lead this team in targets. He missed 2 games last year, had 39 catches on 67 targets for only 58% catch rate. And I think going from Jared Goff to Deshaun Watson is an upgrade for him. So that has an opportunity to improve. And he still had 13.9 yards per reception and 543 receiving yards and just 2 receiving touchdowns. He did get the ball a good amount on the ground. It'll be interesting to see if that continues in Houston. He had 6 rushing attempts and 52 rush yards, no touchdowns though. He was wide receiver 63 overall and just 63rd in targets per game and 58th in consistency. With the Rams, he was 9th in wide receiver rush attempts and 10th in wide receiver rush yards. But again, will that added bonus work be there in Houston? I doubt it. DeAndre Hopkins only had 2 rush attempts last season. And then at playerprofiler.com, unfortunately, he is 12th in injury probability and 32nd in fragility rating, but that is better than his pricier teammate, who was 7th in injury probability and 18th in fragility rating. So while Will Fuller has a history of injury propensity and inconsistency, the cheaper wide receiver on this team, Brandon Cooks, has been more reliable. So for my money, I'd much rather roll the dice on Brandon Cooks than Will Fuller. DeAndre Hopkins was 10th in percentage of teams' average targeted air yards last year. So there's a lot of volume and a lot of air yards available out there. It's starting week 1 and an anticipated shootout with Kansas City in week 1. So, and per rotoworld.com, Brandon Cooks and Randall Cobb were among those named as working out with Deshaun Watson this offseason. Will Fuller, not so much.
Man, not good. And I'm a Cooks guy, and I know, the concussions have been an issue, so, there's a little bit of hesitancy with him heading into the season. But, by all accounts, he's healthy, ready to go. And like you said, there is a ton of volume in this offense to go around, so it's got to go somewhere. I know they have David Johnson in the backfield, and maybe he and Duke will get some of that passing volume. But really, it's got to go to the pass catchers going downfield. So who are you going to trust? Will Fuller? I can't do that. Brandon Cooks, I can a little bit more. So on his better price tag, I certainly like him. Now he's going around a group of wide receivers that I also like a lot. Julian Edelman, I think his volume is pretty safe. Tyler Boyd's going to be an interesting one this season, but then you have Jarvis Landry, a guy who's underappreciated, and then Deontay Johnson with a bunch of question marks in that offense. So really, Cooksy might be my second or third favorite player in this group, and I'd feel perfectly fine with him being my wide receiver 3. Really, I mean I'm fine that, and I'll head into the season feeling great about that pick. All right, so next up, we finally get to another Colts wide receiver, and the next guy off the board is Michael Pittman Jr., who is being drafted as WR59 with the 9th pick in the 13th round. He's going behind John Brown and Brashad Perriman, in front of Alshon Jeffrey and N'Keal Harry. What an interesting group that is. The Colts have the 3rd best wide receiver strength of schedule and the best offensive line. Right now, Michael Pittman Jr.'s aggregate projection is WR67. However, Total Foresight likes him as WR44. According to Dane Brugler, Michael Pittman Jr. is Dane Brugler's rookie wide receiver 9, and he did play all 4 years at USC. I'm going to take a minute to go back and just review his college career. In 2016, he only had 6 catches for 82 yards. In 2017, he had 23 catches for 400 yards. In 2018, he had 41 catches for 750 yards. And then last season, he went over 100 catches with 101 for over 1,200 yards, 1,275, with a 12.6 yards per reception average, and got in the end zone 11 times. A natural progression all 4 years while at USC. According to PlayerProfiler.com, his best comparable is Dwayne Bowe. Wow. Man, haven't said that name in a while. Some notes. Quote, overall, Pittman is a strong-framed pass catcher, and although he has only average speed by NFL standards, he wins with physicality. and focus at the catch point, projecting as a reliable possession target at all 3 levels in the NFL, close quote. From an availability standpoint, if T.Y. continues to be typical T.Y., then Pittman has the opportunity to lead this team in targets, especially in the red zone, when considering he's 6'4" and 223 pounds. At this point, among this group, there's really no one I'd rather take a shot on than Michael Pittman Jr.
Yeah, and I mean, when you look at last year again, considering that the wide receiver on this team that led in red zone targets was Zach Pascal with 11, you'd like to think that Michael Pittman is good for at least 11 red zone targets, because with that frame, he ought to be the wide receiver to see the most red zone targets for the Colts this year. So at his price tag, he's a very interesting guy. And I got to say, amongst that group, I like him the most because Rashad Perriman, while I like the talent, he's got some injury issues that have shown up again, and he is in that Adam Gase New York Jets offense, unfortunately. John Brown has the passer of Josh Allen, and now he's got Stephon Diggs to compete with. Alshon Jeffrey's never healthy. N'Keal Harry showed us nothing last year. There's been some recent positive talk with him out of camp, but again, out of this group, for me, there's no question that I think Michael Pittman is the most intriguing. He is the one who I want to snag with a late round dart throw. Check him out in week 1. How involved is he? How many routes is he running? How many targets is he getting? And if he's somebody who absolutely is not playing that much, let alone being used that much, easy to cut him, easy to move on and cut bait. But if he is somebody that is heavily targeted, and if something happens, unfortunately, to T.Y. like it typically does, then again, he could be the wide receiver on this squad to lead the team in targets.
Absolutely.
So
let's end this on a good note.
Yep, we've got another good wide receiver over there in Indianapolis. It's the Colts wide receiver Paris Campbell. Yes, former Ohio State Buckeye, and
they seem to pop up in our podcast quite a bit, don't they?
Yes, they sure do, Jay. And he is currently going as wide receiver 64 at the 1405, behind Curtis Samuel and Mike Williams, and in front of Larry Fitzgerald and Brian Edwards. Again, third best wide receiver strength of schedule, best offensive line. The aggregate projection and the total Foresight rank are actually behind his ADP. Wide receiver 73 projected, wide receiver 80 in total Foresight, compared to that wide receiver 64 price tag. Last year was just a totally injury-riddled season, played in just 7 games, 18 catches on 24 targets for 127 yards and a touchdown. Not good. If you look at him at playerprofiler.com, his best comp is Santana Moss, and he was 9th in fragility rating, which is not good, not a good way to start off your NFL career. And after that injury-riddled season, Campbell confirmed he was finally 100% health-wise back in May, but then the poor guy gets in a car crash and is currently in the concussion protocol as a result. So hopefully he gets well with that soon. Just bad luck. There's been a lot of off-season buzz about him, but that injury history gives me a little pause, especially when you see Brian Edwards in that group, who has the opportunity to lead the Raiders in targets this year.
I'll tell you what, that Brian Edwards pick is really starting to look like it could be a sneaky great late round acquisition. But yeah, I'm with you, Ben. I was starting to get high on Paris Campbell. He was highly touted as a rookie. It never really materialized because of the injuries. So you're right. There was a lot of buzz coming out of camp. So you were starting to think maybe this is the year he kind of sneaks up and surprises people and could be a great late round steal. But again, some bad luck. Really, so far in his NFL career, he's drawing a lot of comparables in my mind, or a lot of parallels in my mind to, a former Buckeye, Devin Smith, who was a highly drafted guy and went to the Jets and just had injury after injury, which really derailed his career. So, again, a very talented guy, a fun, exciting player when he's on the field, but yeah, just tough to trust right now. So, unfortunately, I too gotta stay away, and I hope he can get back to health, get on the field, and show us what he can do, and maybe become, one of our free agent pickups during the season.
Yeah, maybe it can be a speculative stash at some
There you
point.
go. There you
Uh,
go.
but I got to be honest. I do. That is it for the drafted wide receivers and tight ends of this division. There is one more guy that I am excited about who is going undrafted, which is Randall Cobb. So, if after your draft, if you're not maybe happy with the way your draft turned out and you want to offer some trades and you want to throw in somebody where you're left needing to go pick up a wide receiver, maybe consider Randall Cobb, undrafted wide receiver out of Houston. If you're like Jade and pull off a major blockbuster, I wasn't happy with my draft trade, and improve your team. It's all what it's about, Jay. You improved your team. Good job, buddy.
Thank you.
Do you want to talk about the other
Yeah.
little announcement from yesterday?
Absolutely. We had a big announcement yesterday. We're very excited to bring back the Fantasy Foresight Challenge once again in 2020. If you aren't familiar, it is a 12-team full PPR redraft league. The 6 members of Fantasy Foresight take on 6 invitees in a full season league. The winner of the league takes home a $1,000 cash prize. So, again, exciting. We had a lot of great comments from a lot of people. We invite, some friends from the industry, some allies from the industry, if you will, to come in and participate. We invite friends of the show, listeners in, so we get a nice mix of competitors in the league to take on Team Foresight. And really, everybody from last season was very complimentary. They loved the league. It was incredibly competitive. It was a lot of fun, so we are excited to bring it back once again for 2020 and have some additional excitement, have some more fun, and really, get to know a lot of our listeners and our friends in the industry a little bit better.
I've got to say, my worst injury riddled bad luck season outside of last year's Total Foresight Challenge, my worst finish of all time career was 9th. Man, thank God I finished last place in the Fantasy Foresight Challenge last year, and not our league of record, because our punishments are real for that.
I'll tell you what, though. We had a competitor in the Fantasy Foresight Challenge last season who had both CMC and Lamar Jackson and did not win the league. So the frustration abounds. I'll tell you what, man, I was second in the Fantasy Foresight Challenge last year in total points scored and didn't even make the playoffs. Like, it was a bonkers year in that league. So I can only imagine what it's going to be like this season.
Oh, I'm looking forward to having much less bad luck. Hopefully, a couple more things bounce my way in the draft, and I can help out Team Foresight and help save the brand.
Let's go. We are going to have a much stronger showing for the brand this year. So if you're listening, we'll be sending out tweets as the season goes. We'll keep you posted on how everybody's doing, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So definitely looking forward to that. So Ben, what do we have up next? Only 2 episodes left after this.
All right. So if you're not familiar with our in-season schedule, just know that, we're not done after the preview season. During the season, you know what? After these next 2 episodes, we're going to do something a little bit different, a little bit special, and just give a standalone quick preview to the NFL season opener, just to celebrate the fact that NFL and football is back. And you've got a great matchup with Deshaun Watson and Pat Mahomes, Houston Texans and the Kansas City Chiefs. And then after that, every week we give you a preview of buys and sells for week 1. Steve gives you a list of speculative stashes, a couple of guys that, hey, if you just have some really low upside guys at the end of your bench, maybe consider cutting them and adding a high upside speculative stash on your roster prior to kickoff. And then if something crazy happens and that guy ends up being the top waiver priority, you don't have to worry about it. He's already on your roster because you picked him up as a free agent. And then we come back to you a second time every week to review how good our buys and sells were. And then Steve also gives you a great list of waiver wire acquisition targets for that week. And then we repeat that format all season long. And before we get to that, we are going to finish a very exciting preview episode season with the most exciting division in fantasy football. We have the NFC South coming up. You got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Tom Brady and all that. You got Drew Brees and the Saints. I mean, you've got Teddy B moving over to the Carolina Panthers. And, it's going to be pretty great.
I can't wait. I can't wait, man. We're going to end this thing. We're going to finish up preview season and with the most exciting division. And then when we're done, we get to turn around and it's football week. I can't wait, man.
The schedule just worked out great this year. And then, it's going to be a great time. Football's back, and we're getting closer and closer every day. And we will be back with you with Steve on Wednesday to cover the quarterbacks and the running backs of the NFC South. Can't wait. Welcome, everyone, to Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We're your hosts and co-founders of FantasyForesight.com, coming to you from the Rambo Fixture Company studios. I'm Ben.
And I'm Jay.
You ready to get rolling, Jay?
You know it. Let's do this.
All right, let's go. And I feel like our method and philosophies are going to ring true in a season like this more than other years past. And I really hope that that's reflected in our rankings at Fantasy Pros.